So with the most recent Diablo 4 showcase, we got a ton of new information on systems and changes coming with the expansion. And while I've done a handful of videos going over a lot of this information, if you weren't closely watching the showcase, there's quite a lot of interesting information you may have missed. So I want to go over a handful of the different things I found while re-watching the showcase, some of which seem to just be pointing at some pretty big changes and new additions coming with the expansion. And this list isn't going to follow where they would have been shown in the showcase. I just made a list of how I remember them. Now, the first one I want to go over is something quite interesting that seems to be indicating we're at least getting one new Lair Boss. And this comes from one of the new Endgame skill trees, specifically in the Lair Boss skill tree. And this is Astaroth's Amalgam. So the Amalgam of Rage can ambush you during a boss fight within a Nightmare dungeon. Killing the Amalgam of Rage in Nightmare dungeons can drop unique items associated with Astaroth. Now, right now in Diablo 4, Astaroth, who also rides the Amalgam of Rage, is not a Lair Boss fight. The only way you can go and fight Astaroth and his Amalgam of Rage is first off doing the original main campaign. He's one of the big bosses you fight during the main campaign, but he's also added as a boss fight at the end of Escalation Nightmare Sigils, where you find a Horadric strong room. You complete that, you can get an Escalation Nightmare Sigil, and that will take you through 3 different Nightmare dungeons, and then at the end you fight Astaroth, and he will have randomized affixes that determines the loot he drops. But based upon this card, and it also being in the Lair Boss skill tree, it seems that Astaroth will now have specific uniques dedicated to him, also indicating he's going to be a new Lair Boss. And this is probably also because there's going to be a ton of new uniques with the expansion, so they probably needed more bosses in the Lair Boss system for people to target farm those new uniques, and they probably didn't want to just dilute the pool of Lair Bosses that we already have with a ton of new uniques, because the more uniques they add with every Lair Boss, the harder it is to target farm specific uniques. So if I would have to guess, they're going to be adding multiple new Lair Bosses. Based upon this, it seems Astaroth is going to be one of them. And speaking of the new endgame skill trees, you may have not noticed that there are differently labeled nodes within some of these skill trees. So if you go and look at some of these skill trees, most of the nodes you'll be seeing are nodes you could pick up that are big circles, but some of them are tilted squares that seem to be more regal and kind of a little bit differently colored. And these are seeming to indicate that these nodes do something a bit more different than the other nodes in all of these skill trees, and not even all of these endgame skill trees actually have these different node variants. Now, if you haven't heard of these new endgame skill trees, essentially there's a new warplan system for the endgame, and every piece of endgame content, or specifically 7 endgame systems, will have their own skill trees. You take part in the warplan system, it'll give you experience for these skill trees, and you can put these points into these skill trees to upgrade that content, change what's spawning in there, or augment it in some other way. And like we just went over, one of them may allow an Amalgam of Rage to spawn in Nightmare dungeons that you can defeat to get Lair Boss uniques. But like I went over, when looking at some of these skill trees, some of the nodes are circular, some of the nodes are these tilted squares that look to be more regal and are seemingly going to be more substantial. And it is actually quite important that these have a different circle or a different design to them, especially if you go look at the new skill trees coming with the expansion. You can actually see pretty big differences in the different nodes. Like if you look at the skills and you look at the side pathing upgrades, those are circular, meaning there are going to be less substantial, more stat increasing upgrades, more passive benefits. But then if you go down the middle path, there are 3 of the similar tilted squares, and these are skill variants that can completely change how that skill works, and you can only choose one of them at a time. So if we transfer that over to these new endgame skill trees, these certain nodes that are the tilted squares are seeming to be much more substantial changes to that content. And we actually got a look at one of these different nodes in one of the skill trees. Now we have actually gotten a look at a few of the other nodes, more specifically the Amalgam of Rage one we just looked at is one of the circular ones, but that one doesn't actually remove anything. It just adds adds the chance for the Amalgam of Rage to show up in Nightmare Dungeons. And the reason I mention that is because I think that's actually going to be very specific to how these different node types work, because the node we got to take a look at that is the tilted square is in the Infernal Horde skill tree, and it's Infernal Bargain Obdicite. You no longer gain gem fragments in Infernal Hordes and instead gain bonus Obdicite. Now, I think that's actually quite important. You no longer gain gem fragments, and I think that is actually the big clue to telling us what these different node types are going to do. Based upon this, my assumption is that any of the circles are just kind of upgrades. They give you more or allow some other thing to spawn in a different piece of content where it's never taking anything away, it's always adding something. But I think these tilted squares are probably going to be removing something and adding something else. And I think that's also probably why not all of the skill trees have these different nodes. Like specifically, if you go to the Undercity skill tree, it only has all circular nodes. So there's probably nothing that's going to be taking anything away from the Undercity in the skill tree. But if we go and look at Infernal Hordes, there are a bunch of different nodes that are the tilted squares that seem to be removing something from. And what's also really interesting is that at the point where they scroll over this Infernal Bargain skill point for the Infernal Hordes, there is another tilted square right next to it that is connected to the same circular node that now has a red X on it when they scroll over this node. So my presumption here is that once you go and take this Infernal Bargain Obdicite, that whatever the other node is there, you will no longer be able to take. Now, the most simple explanation for this is that the other node is you can no longer gain Obdicite, instead you gain a lot more gem fragments, so you wouldn't be able to take either of those as they would contradict each other. And we don't know if this is going to be something that's true throughout all of the skill trees, so we don't know if every one of these tilted square nodes is going to have like an opposite in the tree as well, or if this is maybe just an outlier, or this is just something that can happen sometimes. But I'm presuming that this is actually going to be the design language that there is. The circular nodes are always upgrades, they never remove anything. The tilted squares remove something and gain something in its place. And continuing with the new Warplan system, you may have missed that within the Warplan system itself, so the different activity playlists you create, at the top of that panel, there's actually an indicator of how you can improve the rewards and a rank to the system. And based upon some additional information the developers have given us, it seems that these are actually going to be pretty important. So if you don't really know what I'm talking about, the new Warplane system, as we just went over, has the skill trees of the endgame content within them, but the base of the Warplane system is this little pathing type of mini game to where you choose what activities you want to go through and do. You choose 5 total activities. That will be your Warplane playlist for that rank, and then you go complete those different activities. And it'll consist of all of the possible endgame content, and on every single one of these nodes you're choosing between, they will also have different reward modifiers, also based upon the different rarities. So you'll even be able to select activities in the Warplanes that have a legendary reward on them that are seeming to be some amount of random rewards, but they're buffed up depending on the rarity they have on them. And it seems that every single Warplane you do will give you some activity experience towards your endgame skill trees, but the additional loot you get from these are based upon the rarity. So you could go through and pick like a pit run, a Lair Boss run, a Nightmare Dungeon, a pit run in an Undercity, and that would be your run for that rank of the Warplanes. But as I've been saying, there are different ranks at the top shown as out of 10. The one they're currently on is 3 out of 10, and the developers have also said that as you continue to progress throughout the Warplanes, that the trees or the amount of selections you have will get bigger. Now I'm presuming these get wider and not longer because you only have 5 selections no matter what. So presumably between at the top and at the bottom of this tree, it'll always have 5 selections to fully get through it. So presumably the higher rank you get, the wider the tree gets, just giving you more options to choose between. So once you're at the higher ranks of the Warplane system, you'll probably be able to have a much better control at doing the content you want to do and skipping the content you don't want to do. Now there is also a new plan button at the bottom, which I'm presuming is probably going to be free or maybe pretty cheap. But my assumption is that's there because as you get higher and higher ranks in the Warplan system, it is probably going to get more difficult as you go. That's my assumption, and I think it's also backed up because of the text below the shown rank, because it says complete 2 out of 4 Warplans to improve rewards. So they've completed 2 ranks and they're on their 3rd. That's why they have 2 out of 4. So once they've completed 4 different ranks of Warplans, they will start to get improved rewards in the selection. More than likely, this will also get more difficult, which is why being able to reset these is important, because you would never want to get to the point where players got to a too high rank on the Warplans and now they can't complete anything in it anymore. So I think this information at the top of the Warplans is showing that you will get improved rewards and improved difficulty as you get higher and higher into the Warplan system. And this is a smaller thing, but could also be interesting. But at these same points where they were showing off the new Warplane system, we get to see the different currencies that this player has tracked. And they have gold tracked, obels tracked, and some new currency that looks to be a coin with a bell. And they are also tracking this twice, which may be something new or just may be part of the dev build. And this currency, this coin with a bell, is not currently in the game. So this isn't something that's super crazy or anything, but it does seem to be some new main currency being added with the expansion, and we don't really have anything that's been revealed to us yet. So this may be some new reward system that we have not been told about yet. Now, another thing you may have missed that is small in itself but points towards a much more important change is that in some of the gameplay, and more specifically when they were going over the new Warplane system, is that we did get to see a player fighting against a Chaos Rift in a Helltide they were doing. Now, if you remember from Season 10, the Season of Chaos, Chaos Rifts could show up in Helltides or in dungeons, or more specifically, Chaos Rift dungeons. And these would spew out enemies, they would spew out Chaos monsters, and you'd have to destroy specific Chaos monsters that were tied to the portal. Then you could destroy the portal, and it would also give you some pretty big buff. It would also give you like currency and other things for that season. It was also something players really liked, because these Chaos portals also had a rarity on them that would give different rewards, and you could find a mythic Chaos portal that will give you a mythic item. It was incredibly rare, but I personally did find one of them during that season. So there was just a ton of different things you could get from these, and it seems that they are back, and based upon other information we have for the new endgame skill trees from the Warplane system, this is probably going to be one of the options in the skill tree for Helltides, because we also got it confirmed by developers that other seasonal content is coming back through these new endgame skill trees. They specifically mentioned that one of the nodes allows Bloodseekers to hunt you in Nightmare Dungeons, which is from Season 2, the Season of Blood, which was essentially the vampire season. The Bloodseekers were essentially vampire versions of our player classes that were super buffed up, and they would hunt you, and they could randomly show up like the Butcher in Nightmare Dungeons, and a pack of them would spawn in, and they were actually significantly stronger than Butchers. They were ridiculously strong with a ridiculous amount of health. So while just these Chaos portals coming back, it's also pointing towards the information that a lot of previous seasonal mechanics can also be making their way back in these new endgame skill trees. Now, the final thing I want to go over has a few possibilities, and whichever way it goes, this is going to have a pretty big impact on how we gear in Diablo 4, and this is looking at the new gear modification recipe in the Horadric Cube called Add Affix. So if you haven't heard about this, the Horadric Cube is being added into Diablo 4 at the next expansion. It's going to be pretty heavily inspired from Diablo 2's Horadric Cube and a bit from Diablo 3's, and it's essentially going to be a crafting cube. We got to see 2 different categories of recipes: item transmutation, which is essentially taking items you already have in-game that you farmed up and turn them into something different. So like turning 3 of one unique into a random rolled version of the same unique, turning 3 like random items into like another random item, or taking 1 rare item with a few new resources and turning it into a random legendary. So that's kind of the crafting item side. Then we got to see a few crafts in the gear modification section. Now, the only one they scrolled over was Add Affix, which you would probably think it just adds a random affix to an item, and it takes some resources to do that. And that is actually what they they show in the footage. They take a rare ring, which you need one in normal magic rare or legendary item. You need a few of the new resources from the expansion, and it'll add an affix to that item. But you may have missed that on this craft, it also says tuning prisms can be used to modify the category of the affix that is added. Now, there's two different options with this in my mind. First one is the more boring one in that most items in the game have a few different categories of affixes that can roll on them. Like if you say, for instance, a helmet can roll defensive rolls like health or armor or things like that, but it also has certain +2 skill ranks on as well. Like on a druid, I could get +2 poison creeper on my helmet. Now, you can't get +2 all skills on the helmet, so presumably those defensives and those specific skill rank increases would be certain categories of affixes, and with these tuning prisms, you would be able to choose the affix between the categories that could normally roll on that item. The much more interesting possibility, if you use these tuning prisms, you can actually add affixes that normally couldn't be on that item. So for instance, normally on legs, primarily defensive stats and then some utility stats. But let's say you go and use this craft to add an affix to those legs, and you use a tuning prism, maybe you could add an offensive affix to those legs. So maybe you take those legs, use a tuning prism with this new roll on it, and maybe you could add like crit chance to those legs. And this second option is much more interesting and just has the possibility to allow for a lot crazier gear customization, because that can not only allow you to get maybe the defensives you need much more easily by adding defensives to certain items that maybe you don't need a different specific roll on, or it could just allow you to, again, add the offensive rolls to items that normally couldn't have them. And at the high end, that could potentially change up what uniques you're using. Because maybe you're using a unique in a slot because you need to hit a certain breakpoint of stats you normally couldn't get. And maybe now being able to add affixes that normally couldn't be on items, you can add a few of those affixes to multiple items, and now you don't have to use that unique anymore. And I do think there's a higher chance of this more unlocked possibility being the actual way this is going to work, because we also aren't going to be having the strongest affixes possible anymore. And I'm more specifically talking about amulets. So right now in Diablo 4, pretty much every amulet you want is going to have as many increases to passive nodes in your skill tree. I'm sure you've seen like every build planner having amulets for different increases to passive skills, and that just giving you absurd multiplicative damage increases. But going into the expansion, our skill trees no longer have passive nodes on them, so those won't exist anymore. So with that being taken away, meaning a ton of potential power, there is the possibility that they are just going to allow us to customize our gear a lot more, because if they added this add affix system previously and the tuning prisms allowed you to add categories of affixes you normally couldn't find on that item, every single item would now just have a +2 passive rank on it, and you would choose nothing else because nothing else would be viable. But since those no longer exist and none of the affixes are even close to as strong as those plus passive affixes are, this could actually be the possibility that now we could have legs with like crit chance on them. And this final thing is a bit of cheating because we didn't get to see it in the showcase, but under gear modification, there is another section or another recipe called transfigure item, and they never scrolled over this, but in a developer Q&A after the showcase, they did say this is where sanctification is going to be returning under this specific gear modification. And while they said it won't be a one-to-one with sanctification, it'll be pretty close. So that's also going to be another pretty massive addition to gear modification. And just based upon those two pieces of information, it seems like gear modification is going to get a massive overhaul and massive new additions coming into the expansion. But that's all of the main things I could find from the recent Diablo 4 showcase that you may have missed, the developers really didn't specifically talk about, but showed in the actual footage. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.